Margaret Chen had not heard another human voice in 3 years, 4 months, and 17 days. She knew this with mathematical precision because she kept a tally on the calendar in her kitchen, each day marked with a small, deliberate X in black ink. The house at Blackthorn Lane did not encourage visitors. It seemed to actively repel them with an almost sentient hostility, as if the very structure itself conspired to keep the world at distance. Neighbors had stopped coming after the incident with Mrs. Caldwell, though Margaret could never quite remember what had happened during that particular conversation. The details were slippery, evasive, like trying to grip wet soap in the shower. She remembered Mrs. Caldwell's face going pale. She remembered a sound like breaking glass, though there had been no broken glass anywhere in the house. She remembered the woman running down the front steps and never looking back, her purse clutched to her chest, her face twisted in an expression of pure terror. But the specifics of what had been said, what had transpired in the hallway between the front door and the living room, remained frustratingly out of reach, like a word on the tip of the tongue that would never quite materialize. Margaret had spent the better part of 3 years wondering if she had imagined the entire incident. Perhaps Mrs. Caldwell had never visited at all. Perhaps the memory was something her mind had constructed to fill the terrible silence, to create a narrative that explained why she was so utterly alone in a house that had once been full of people. Her husband had been gone for nearly 2 decades now. He had died in his sleep one Tuesday in March, and she had woken to find him cold beside her, his skin already beginning to cool, his chest still. Her daughter lived in California with her own family, 2 children, a son-in-law who worked in technology, a life that Margaret had never quite understood and had eventually stopped trying to. They called on holidays, though the conversations had become increasingly stilted and awkward over the years, filled with long silences and conversations about the weather and the mundane details of their separate existences. Eventually, the calls had stopped altogether. It had been 4 years since she had last spoken to her daughter. 4 years of complete silence in that direction. So Margaret lived alone at Blackthorn Lane with her routines and her tallies and her slowly expanding collection of silences. The house was a colonial-style structure dating back to the 1920s, with dark wood paneling in the study, a grand staircase that curved upward with practiced elegance, and large windows that looked out onto a yard she had long ago stopped attempting to maintain. The lawn had gone to seed years ago. The rose garden her mother had helped her plant when she first moved in had grown wild and unkempt, thorny and beautiful in its abandonment. She liked it this way. She liked the way nature gradually reclaimed the spaces that humans stopped maintaining. It felt honest somehow, like a return to truth. On the evening of October 13th, a Tuesday that felt like all the other Tuesdays, distinguished only by its number on the calendar, another mark on the wall, Margaret was microwaving a frozen lasagna when she heard them. Footsteps, deliberate, measured footsteps moving across the ceiling above her head with the unmistakable weight of human presence. Not the settling sounds of an old house, the groaning of wood, the subtle shifting of foundations as temperature changed and wood expanded and contracted. Not the scratching of rats or the scurrying of squirrels in the walls. The familiar nighttime sounds she had learned to ignore over the years. These were footsteps. Someone, or something, was walking in her attic with purposeful, rhythmic strides. The sound was so clear, so present, so undeniably real that Margaret's mind recoiled from the implication. The problem was straightforward and impossible. Margaret's house had no attic. She knew this because she had lived in the colonial-style home for 19 years. She had examined every blueprint when she first purchased the property, studying the architectural drawings in the realtor's office with the obsessive attention of someone looking for hidden flaws. She had traced her fingers along the interior walls on the second floor and found nothing but solid wood and insulation. The roof was pitched at precisely 42 degrees. She had measured it herself with a laser level purchased from Home Depot for $89.95, and she still had the receipt in a filing cabinet upstairs, and she had done the mathematical calculations to confirm that there was absolutely no crawl space, no storage cavity, no hidden room tucked beneath the eaves. The space simply did not exist. It was architecturally impossible. It violated the basic laws of geometry and structure. It was, according to every measurement she had taken and every calculation she had performed, completely and utterly non-existent. Yet the footsteps continued. Back and forth. Back and forth. moving from the eastern wall to the western wall with methodical purpose, as if whoever was up there was searching for something, or searching for her. The sound was neither hurried nor casual. It possessed the quality of someone conducting a systematic investigation, moving methodically through a space, checking things, looking for something specific. Margaret found her hands had begun to shake. She stood motionless in her kitchen, the microwave beeping in unheeded protest behind her. The lasagna rotated behind the glass, catching the light with each revolution, casting shadows that danced across the pale yellow of the kitchen walls. She was 68 years old. Her hands trembled slightly, though she attributed this to something she couldn't quite name. Not fear exactly, something older and deeper than fear. Fear required the capacity to imagine different outcomes, and Margaret had stopped being able to do that a long time ago. Fear required choices, alternatives, the possibility that things could be otherwise. Margaret's life had narrowed down to a single path, a single trajectory, a single inevitable progression through the days marked on her calendar. And yet, in this moment, the possibility of something other than what she expected was suddenly very real. She moved to the base of the stairs and listened. The footsteps had stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse, a pregnant, expectant quiet that seemed to pulse with anticipation, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for her next move. Margaret knew this sensation well. She had lived with it for 19 years, ever since she had moved into Blackthorn Lane. It was the feeling of being watched. Not threatened, necessarily, but observed, studied, catalogued by some unseen presence that existed just beyond the edge of perception. She climbed the stairs slowly, her hand sliding along the banister that had been worn smooth by decades of use. The wood was warm under her palm, warm in a way that living wood should not be warm, as if something underneath the varnish was radiating heat. The hallway on the second floor stretched before her, lined with doors, her bedroom with its queen-sized bed and the quilt her mother had made in 1982 with its patterns of blue and white stars, the guest room she never used with its twin beds and the dresser she kept meaning to refinish, the bathroom with the vintage pink tile she kept meaning to update or at least accept as part of the house's historical charm, the small study where she spent her afternoons reading novels from the library, books she selected seemingly at random, but never retained any memory of once she had finished them, as if the words dissolved from her mind the moment she closed the cover. And at the far end of the hallway, barely visible in the gathering dusk of early evening, was the attic access panel. Margaret stopped dead. Every muscle in her body went rigid. She had never seen that panel before. She was absolutely certain of this fact. She had walked this hallway every single day for 19 years. She had dusted the surfaces with a cloth and lemon-scented furniture polish, following a pattern she had developed years ago. She had vacuumed the carpet with meticulous attention, moving in straight lines from the bedroom to the bathroom to the study, creating geometric patterns in the pile that satisfied something deep in her need for order. She had replaced the light bulb in the overhead fixture exactly 43 times. She remembered this because she had written it down in a notebook, tracking the bulb's lifespan with the same precision she applied to everything else. She knew every molecule of this hallway's geography. She could navigate it blindfolded, which she had actually tested on occasion, simply to confirm that her memory was as accurate as she believed it to be. She had memorized the slight give in the third floorboard from the left. She had noted the water stain on the ceiling plaster that had expanded by approximately 1 inch per year, a measurement she had tracked on a piece of paper she kept hidden in her study. She knew where the radiator pipes hummed in winter. She knew which windows rattled when the wind came from the north. She knew the exact number of steps from the bedroom door to the bathroom, 17 steps if you took normal-length strides. There had never been an attic access panel. But there it was. There it undeniably, impossibly was, a rectangular outline in the ceiling, perhaps 3 feet by 2 feet, with a brass handle gleaming softly in the dying light of the autumn evening. The handle was ornate, Victorian in style, with decorative scrollwork and what appeared to be initials engraved in the metal. Margaret could not quite make out what the initials were. MC, perhaps. Margaret Chen. Her own initials, or perhaps she was imagining that. Perhaps she was seeing what she expected to see, projecting her own name onto a surface that bore no such marking. The human mind was capable of such tricks. especially in the case of someone who had been isolated for as long as she had. As she stared at the panel, she heard the sound again. Not footsteps this time. Something else. A dragging sound. Something heavy being moved across the floor above her head. Something that should not be able to move in a space that did not exist. The sound was accompanied by a soft, rhythmic thumping, almost like a heartbeat, but too slow, too deliberate to be a heartbeat of anything living. It sounded more like machinery, like the beating of some vast metallic heart, like the pulse of something ancient and mechanical. Margaret's rational mind offered several explanations, each one more appealing than the last. She was hallucinating. The stress of her isolation had finally broken something fundamental in her psychology, some critical load-bearing structure of her sanity. She was experiencing some form of neurological event, a stroke perhaps, or a transient ischemic attack, or the early stages of dementia. She was dreaming and would wake at any moment in her bed, heart pounding, grateful for the return to reality, grateful to discover that the attic had never existed, and the panel had never appeared, and everything was exactly as it should be. She had read about Charles Bonnet syndrome, about how the brain can create entirely convincing false perceptions when it becomes sufficiently isolated from external stimuli. 3 years, 4 months, and 17 days without human contact could do that to a person. Could scramble the circuits, could short-circuit the connections between perception and reality. The medical literature was full of such cases. There were documented instances of complete psychological breaks, triggered by nothing more than extended solitude. But there was another explanation, the one that lurked at the edge of her consciousness like something in deep water, something vast and patient and older than memory. The explanation she had been avoiding ever since she had moved into this house 19 years ago. The explanation that suggested something was fundamentally wrong with the house itself, with her understanding of the house, with the nature of her existence within its walls, with the possibility that she had never truly been alone at all, and that whatever had been watching her from the spaces between spaces had finally decided to reveal itself. She reached up toward the handle. The hallway seemed to stretch and contract around her as she moved, the walls breathing like lungs, the ceiling descending and ascending in slow, rhythmic pulses. She could feel her heart accelerating in her chest, could feel the blood moving through her veins with an urgency it had not possessed in years. The sensation was not entirely unpleasant. It was almost like waking up after a very long sleep. The moment her fingertips touched the brass, cold, so cold it burned like dry ice against her skin, so cold it felt like fire. The footsteps started again. Frantic now, running back and forth, multiple sets of footsteps, she realized, with a spike of genuine terror that cut through her carefully constructed calm. Dozens of them, hundreds, perhaps, maybe thousands. Crisscrossing the impossible space above her head, moving with desperate urgency, as if fleeing from something, or pursuing something. The distinction seemed important, but remained frustratingly unclear. The sounds overlapped, created a cacophony of motion that seemed physically impossible. So many people moving in so many directions in a space that was supposed to be empty. And then a sound like furniture being overturned, the sharp crack of wood splitting, the crash of breaking glass, though she knew there was nothing up there to break. A voice, distant but unmistakably human, screaming something she couldn't quite make out. More voices joining in, until the cacophony of sound seemed to shake the very foundations of the house. She could hear words now, fragmented and barely coherent. "Help me!" someone screamed. "Get out!" another voice cried. "It's not real!" "Oritsi," third voice whispered, so quietly that Margaret almost didn't hear it. None of this is real. Margaret pulled her hand back as if she had been burned. The brass left a pattern on her fingertips, red marks that looked like frostbite, like brands, like something had seared itself into her skin and would not let go. The sound stopped instantly, as if a switch had been flipped. The silence returned, absolute and suffocating, pressing down on her like a physical weight that seemed to have mass and substance. She stood in the hallway, breathing hard, her hand stinging where she had touched the handle. The brass was no longer cold. It was warm, almost hot, as if it had been waiting for her touch, as if her skin against its surface had activated something that had been dormant for a very long time. She could feel heat radiating from it, warmth, that seemed to have nothing to do with external temperature. The handle pulsed gently, almost like a heartbeat, and Margaret realized with a start that it was synchronizing with her own pulse. When her heart beat faster, the handle warmed. When she took a breath and tried to calm herself, the handle cooled slightly. It was as if the brass had become an extension of her own body, or as if her body had become an extension of the brass. She went downstairs. She finished her lasagna, which had grown cold and congealed on the microwave's rotating plate. The cheese had solidified into a rubbery layer. The pasta had become tough and difficult to chew. The sauce had separated into layers of oil and tomato paste. She ate it anyway, not tasting it, simply performing the mechanical action of feeding her body. Fuel. That's all it was. She washed the dish under hot water, dried it carefully with a cloth, put it away in the cabinet with the other bowls and plates, all arranged in ascending order of size. She moved through the evening rituals of her solitary life with mechanical precision. She did not turn on the television. She did not read. She did not play music or listen to podcasts or engage in any of the activities that other people use to fill the silence. Instead, she sat in her living room with the lights off, listening to the darkness of her house settle around her like a living thing. And at midnight she heard the attic door open. The sound was unmistakable, a wooden panel being drawn downward, hinges creaking as they rotated for the first time in what should have been forever. Steps descended, wooden steps that had no business existing, steps that should have been impossible. The sound came from upstairs, followed by the creak of wooden steps descending, each one groaning under weight. Margaret heard the sound from the point where the attic door opened to the point where the steps reached the second-floor hallway. She counted the steps. There were 27 of them. That would have required a drop of more than 30 feet. It was impossible. Margaret remained perfectly still on her sofa. She did not move. She did not call out. She did not turn on the lights or attempt to flee or do any of the things that a person in a horror story was supposed to do. She simply sat in the darkness and listened to something descend from an attic that did not exist, coming down to find her. She heard it reach the second-floor hallway. She heard it pause outside her bedroom door. She heard it breathe. A sound, like wind through a tunnel, like the last gasp of something drowning in air, like the exhalation of a creature that had not drawn breath in a very long time. Then she heard it move on, down the hallway, toward the stairs that led to the first floor where she sat. Slowly, with excruciating care, Margaret stood. She moved silently toward the kitchen. She knew the layout of her house so well she could navigate it blindfolded, and she might have preferred that. In the dark, at least, she could pretend she didn't know what was coming down the stairs. In the dark, at least, she could maintain the fiction that this was not really happening. The footsteps reached the first-floor landing. She heard them clearly. Now, not the footsteps of multiple people, but of a single entity. A single presence. It moved across the hardwood with measured purpose, each step deliberate and assured. Margaret stood at the entrance to the kitchen, her hand on the counter, ready to run. Ready to go where, she had no idea. There was nowhere to run in this house. Nowhere to hide. She had explored every square inch of it, had mapped it completely in her mind, and there were no hiding places. No closets deep enough, no cabinets large enough, no basements or sub-basements or spaces between walls. The house was solid, impenetrable, and entirely without refuge. The footsteps stopped directly behind her. She could hear it breathing now. That drowning sound breath, just inches away from the back of her neck. She could smell something ancient and wrong, like flowers left too long in a closed room, like meat preserved in formaldehyde, like dust from a crypt that had been sealed for centuries. The smell made her stomach turn. It was the smell of things that should not exist, of spaces that should not be inhabited, of time moving in directions that should not be possible. "Hello, Margaret," it said. Her own voice. It was her own voice, speaking from behind her, speaking words she had not spoken. "Hello, Margaret," the voice said again with perfect precision, perfect inflection, perfect familiarity. "You've been waiting for so long." "We've all been waiting." Margaret turned around, and what she saw in her darkened kitchen made no sense. It was her. Exactly her. The same face, the same body, the same everything, except the eyes were completely black. Not black iris and pupil, but entirely black, as if someone had poured ink into the sockets. The blackness seemed to move, to swirl with some kind of internal motion, as if there were things swimming in those eyes, things with intentions and desires. "What?" Margaret began. "What am I?" Her doppelganger finished. "I'm the part of you that walked into the attic, the part that never left, the part that's been waiting in the impossible space for you to find your way back. I've been waiting for 19 years, Margaret. Waiting in the darkness, watching you, waiting for you to finally touch the handle. I've never been in the attic." "There is no attic." "Yes, there is," the thing said, and now it smiled, and its teeth were too numerous, crowding the mouth like a school of fish in a tank too small. There were more teeth than should have been possible to fit into a human mouth. They were all sharp, all pointed, all arranged in rows that descended backward into the throat. "It's always been there. You've always been there. We've all been there. I'm Margaret from yesterday. She's Margaret from the day before. The others are Margaret from all the days before that. We're all here now, Margaret. We've all been here all along." "This is impossible," Margaret whispered. "No, it isn't," the first doppelganger said. "It's the only possible thing. It's the only thing that makes sense. You walked up to the attic access panel and you opened it. 19 years ago, or was it 3 years, 4 months, and 17 days ago? Time works differently in the attic, Margaret. Time moves in circles. Time moves backward and forward simultaneously. Time is not linear there. It's more like a knot, like something tangled in on itself." "This is a dream," Margaret said, but she knew it wasn't. She had not dreamed in years. Sleep had become something mechanical for her, a process of lying down and allowing the hours to pass, without the complications of dreams or nightmares or unconscious processing. But this was too vivid to be a dream. This had too much weight, too much presence. "It's not a dream," the doppelganger confirmed. "It's memory, or it's premonition, or it's both. In the attic, the difference doesn't exist. All moments exist at once. All versions of Margaret exist simultaneously. And you've finally reached the point where you have to accept what you've always known. You've been up there the entire time. That's what you were counting, not the days without hearing a human voice. The days you've been trapped up there. The days you've been alone in the impossible space trying to find your way back." Behind the doppelganger, Margaret saw movement. Shapes in the darkness. More versions of herself stepping out of the shadows, their eyes black and empty and infinite. There were 3 of them at first, then more, then dozens, pouring into the kitchen like water, like smoke, like an infestation of the impossible. "No," Margaret said. "I've been living my life. I have routines. I eat, I sleep. I go to the library. Do you?" the doppelganger asked. "Or do you remember doing those things? Or do you remember remembering doing those things? When was the last time you actually saw another person? When was the last time you left the house?" Margaret opened her mouth to answer, then closed it. She couldn't remember. She knew she had gone to the library, but the memory was hazy, dreamlike, possibly false. She remembered the librarian's face, a woman with graying hair and glasses, but now that she tried to focus on it, the features became unclear, shifting into generic approximations of a face, like the default avatar on a computer before a user uploads a profile picture. She remembered the smell of old books, but it felt like a composite smell, a generalized library smell rather than the specific scent of her library. She remembered walking down the street, but the street was indistinct. The houses all looked the same. The trees were repetitive. It was like a landscape painted by someone who had never actually visited a real place. "The attic," the doppelganger continued, moving closer, its black eyes fixed on Margaret's face, "is what's left when you leave the world, when you stop being part of reality, when you become something that shouldn't exist anymore but hasn't finished being real yet, when you're stuck between being alive and being gone. That's the attic, Margaret. That's what we all are. All of us who walked up into the space that doesn't exist, looking for a way out. All of us who can't quite let go of being real, even though we've stopped being alive." "You're lying," Margaret said. But her voice was weak, uncertain. "I'm you," the doppelganger said simply. "I can't be lying. I can only be remembering." Behind the doppelganger, the other versions of Margaret began to move forward. They were not walking in any normal sense. They were gliding or drifting or moving through space as if the distance between them and Margaret was purely theoretical, something that existed only in her perception and could be overcome through force of will. Their mouths opened and they all spoke at once. their voices layered and strange, harmonizing and discordant at the same time. You have to go back up there. Margaret, you have to climb the stairs. You have to reach for the handle. You have to open the door one last time. You have to stop looking for a way out. There is no way out of the attic. Margaret, but if you stop looking for one, maybe it will be less lonely. Maybe you will be less afraid. Maybe you will finally understand what happened. On the day you touched the brass handle, maybe. You will finally remember why you came here in the first place. Margaret backed away. She moved toward the living room, and the doppelgangers parted, creating a corridor through which she could walk. They watched her with those infinite black eyes, not moving aggressively, not advancing or threatening, simply watching and waiting with a patience that suggested they had all the time in the world. And of course they did. Time didn't work the same way in the attic. They could wait forever. They had already been waiting forever. She moved back through the house, navigating the familiar spaces, but now everything looked different. The walls seemed thinner. The door seemed less real. The structure of the house appeared to be becoming translucent, as if the solid matter that composed it was gradually dematerializing. She could see through the walls now, could see into the spaces beyond the visible surfaces. And what she saw there was not earth or external space, but more of the same endless dark that characterized the attic. She went upstairs. She moved down the hallway toward the access panel, which now hung open, a dark rectangle in the ceiling like a mouth waiting to swallow. A wooden ladder extended down from the opening, steps newly visible in the darkness. Margaret climbed. The attic was not what she expected. It was vast, impossibly vast, larger than the entire house should have been able to contain. The ceiling stretched upward into shadow. The floor extended in all directions into darkness. The walls, if they could be called walls, seemed to curve away into dimensions that her eyes could not quite process. And everywhere, absolutely everywhere, there were people. They stood motionless in the gloom, thousands of them, perhaps millions, each one wearing the same face as Margaret. Each one dressed in the same clothes she wore. Each one watching her climb down the ladder with those terrible black eyes. They were all versions of her. All the versions of Margaret who had ever walked up into the attic. All the iterations of herself that had been trapped in this impossible space. They were arranged in a pattern that Margaret's mind tried and failed to comprehend. Not randomly scattered, but organized in some way that suggested a logic beyond her current understanding. They seemed to be arranged by age, perhaps, with the youngest versions closest to the ladder, and the oldest versions extending back into the darkness. Or perhaps they were arranged by the date they had entered the attic. Or perhaps they were arranged by the degree of their transformation, with the least transformed closest and the most transformed disappearing entirely into shadow. Margaret stood on the floor of the impossible space, her heart hammering in her chest, and she knew with sudden, crystalline clarity what must happen next. The same thing that had always happened. The same cycle repeating forever. The same descent, the same realization, the same acceptance. How long? She asked the nearest duplicate. How long what? The version of herself asked in her voice. How long until I become them? Margaret gestured at the thousands of empty-eyed duplicates stretching away into the darkness. How long until I stop trying to escape? How long until the black takes over my eyes completely, and I become just another version waiting in the dark? That depends, her duplicate said. How long can you hold on to the idea that you're still real? That there was a world before the attic? That you ever left this place? That you were ever anything other than this? Margaret looked down at her hands. They were becoming transparent, and as she watched, she could see through them to the floor of the attic below. The wood was visible through her palm. Her fingers were becoming less opaque, less solid, less real with each moment she spent trying to remember what it felt like to be alive. She was fading, becoming less real with each moment she spent trying to escape. What happens if I accept it? Margaret asked. If I stop fighting? If I just let go? Then you get to stop feeling so alone, the duplicate said. And now there was something almost like kindness in the black eyes. Something that suggested understanding, sympathy, a recognition of shared suffering. Then you join us in the waiting. Then you become part of the pattern. Then you stop experiencing the desperate hope that there's a way out, because you finally understand that there never was a way out. You were never alive, Margaret. You died a long time ago, 19 years ago on the day you touched the brass handle. Everything since then has been you trying to convince yourself that you survived it. But you didn't survive it. No one survives the attic. The attic is what happens when you don't survive. I don't understand, Margaret whispered. The house knows, her duplicate said. The house has been trying to tell you all these years. It's why it felt wrong. It's why neighbors stopped visiting. It's why you couldn't quite form real memories of leaving the house or interacting with people. It's why you've been counting the days in a calendar instead of living them. It's why the isolation hasn't driven you mad the way isolation should have driven you mad, because isolation is only torture for the living. For the dead, isolation is just existence. Margaret looked back at the ladder. She could climb down. She could try again. She could attempt once more to escape the attic that did not exist, to return to the world that had never quite existed either, to resume the life of a widow counting days in a house that had no attic. She could live out another cycle, another loop, another iteration of this impossible existence. She could wake up in her bed with no memory of any of this, and walk the hallway again, and hear the footsteps again, and reach for the handle again. The cycle would repeat. It always repeated, or she could stop. She could surrender. She could let the black creep into her eyes like ink, like understanding, like acceptance. She could become one of the watchers, one of the infinite Margarets in the infinite attic that existed in the space where she should have ceased to be but somehow continued on. She could accept what she had always known but never admitted, that she was dead, that the house was a tomb, that the years of isolation had not been years at all, but rather moments, frozen and repeated, an eternal present tense with no past and no future. She turned away from the ladder. She walked deeper into the attic, into the darkness where the other versions of herself waited with infinite patience. And as she walked, she felt her edges beginning to blur, her sense of self beginning to dissolve into something larger and stranger and more terrible. The black was creeping up from her fingertips now, spreading up her arms like ink in water, like gangrene, like the spread of corruption through living flesh. Except she was not living and she was not flesh. She was something else entirely. She passed through the crowd of Margarets. They parted for her like water, creating a path that led deeper into the darkness. She could feel them watching her as she passed, could feel the weight of their collective attention, the accumulated despair of millions of versions of herself, all recognizing in this new Margaret the mirror of their own descent. She was becoming one of them. She was joining the pattern. She was losing her individuality and merging into the collective consciousness of the attic. Her thoughts became less singular, more plural. Her I became we. Her identity fragmented into 1,000 smaller selves, each one aware of the others. Each one part of a larger consciousness that stretched back through infinite iterations. As she moved deeper, Margaret began to see the structure of the attic more clearly. It was not random or chaotic. There was a rhythm to it, a pattern. The Margarets were arranged in concentric circles, like ripples in water, with the most recent arrivals closest to the ladder and the oldest versions disappearing entirely into a darkness so complete that even perception became impossible. At the very center, which she somehow knew without being able to perceive it directly, was the original Margaret. The first one, the one who had touched the brass handle at some point so distant that it had ceased to matter. That Margaret had been here so long that she had become something else entirely, something that could no longer be called Margaret. Something that was more like a principle or a fundamental law of the attic itself. Behind her, new footsteps began to descend the ladder. Another Margaret, another version, another iteration of the impossible cycle. She was climbing down from the attic that did not exist, and she would soon be standing in the darkened kitchen, about to discover that she had been there all along. Trapped in the impossible space, about to begin the same realization, the same descent, the same inevitable return. The new Margaret moved through the attic with the same confusion and terror that the previous Margaret had experienced, and the version that had just descended watched her with the black eyes and waited for her to understand. Margaret watched as the new version climbed down. She watched as the new version looked around in confusion, as the new version's eyes adjusted to the darkness, as the new version began to understand the truth that all the others had learned before her, and she felt nothing. Or rather, she felt a kind of peace, the peace that comes from surrendering, from accepting the inevitable, from allowing yourself to become part of something larger than yourself. The peace of knowing that the struggle is over, that you have finally reached the destination you've been traveling toward all along. The cycle would continue. It would always continue. Because somewhere, in another kitchen, In another house very much like this one, or perhaps in this same house, in a different iteration of it, another widow was hearing footsteps in her attic. Another Margaret was looking up at a ceiling she had never seen an opening in before. Another Margaret was about to reach for a brass handle and discover that she was not the first to touch it. Another Margaret was about to begin the descent. And the attic would expand, would create new spaces, would accommodate this new version, just as it had accommodated all the ones before her. The black had reached Margaret's eyes now. It spread across her vision like curtains closing, obscuring the world beyond, until all that remained was darkness. But within the darkness, she could see more clearly than she ever had. She could perceive the structure of the attic. She could sense the other Margarets around her. She could feel the pulse of the brass handle from far above, still waiting for the next version of herself to climb the ladder. She could understand with perfect clarity the nature of her existence. She was dead. She had been dead for 19 years. She had died the moment she touched the brass handle, the moment she opened the attic door that should not have existed. Everything after that, the house, the calendar, the counts of days, the visits to the library, the meals she had prepared, had all been afterimage, a ghost of a life, a memory of being alive that was slowly fading into something else. The attic was not a place she had entered. The attic was what she had become, and then Margaret opened her eyes. She was standing in her kitchen. The microwave was beeping. The lasagna was rotating inside it, catching the light. The evening was just beginning to turn to dusk, the sun beginning its descent below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. She looked at the calendar on the wall. October 13th, a Tuesday. She looked at the tallies on the calendar. 3 years, 4 months, and 17 days marked with X's in black ink. Or was it a different number now? She couldn't quite remember. The numbers seemed to shift when she wasn't looking directly at them. Margaret heard footsteps in the attic. The colonial-style home at Blackthorn Lane stood silent around her as she stood in the kitchen, microwave beeping in unheeded protest. She had lived here for 19 years and never noticed the attic before. But there it was. There had always been footsteps in the attic. There would always be footsteps in the attic, and she had always been the one walking there. She climbed the stairs slowly, one hand on the banister worn smooth by decades of something, use, perhaps, or touch, or the passage of time itself. Her fingers traced the wood as if trying to read a message written in grain and varnish. The hallway stretched before her, longer than it should be, and at the far end, barely visible in the gathering dusk, was the attic access panel. She had never seen that panel before. She was certain of it. She had been certain of this before, many times before, each time sure that this was the first time. This was the moment where everything changed. This was when she would finally understand. But the certainty dissolved the moment she tried to hold it. The memory of knowing that she had never seen the panel before began to fade, replaced by a growing awareness that she must have seen it before, that it had always been there, that she was simply remembering it for the first time again. The brass handle gleamed in the dimming light. She could see her reflection in it, or what should have been her reflection. But the face that looked back at her was not quite right. The eyes were dark, darker than they should be. Or was she simply remembering what the eyes would look like after she descended into the attic? Was she perceiving her future self reflected in the past moment? Margaret reached toward the brass handle. The moment her fingers touched the cold metal, cold, always cold, burning like dry ice, she remembered everything. All of it, all the descents, all the cycles. All the time she had stood in this hallway and reached for this handle and felt this same terrible understanding. All the versions of Margaret stretching back through time, reaching forward through time, existing simultaneously in all moments, all ages, all stages of understanding and acceptance and transformation. She remembered the day she had first walked up into the attic. She was younger then. Her husband had still been alive. They had just bought the house, and the realtor had mentioned an attic. Impossible, according to the blueprints, but the realtor had insisted there was one. A secret space, a bonus room. She had climbed up to find it. She had touched the handle, and she had never come back down. Or rather, she had come down but not to the house. She had descended into something else, something that looked like the house but wasn't quite. A version of the house where the doors led to different rooms than they should, where the hallways were slightly too long, where the windows looked out onto landscapes that didn't quite match reality. And then she had died in that version of the house and descended further into another version, another layer, another iteration of the same impossible space. And now, in this version, she was beginning the cycle again. She was reaching for the handle. She was about to open the door. She was about to discover that she had never left the attic at all. The footsteps began again, more frantic now, running back and forth in the impossible space above her head. Multiple sets of footsteps, dozens, hundreds, thousands, all moving with desperate urgency, all searching for a way out, all slowly accepting that there was no way out, that the attic was all there was, that death was simply a descent into another level of the same attic, and that this cycle would continue forever. She pulled her hand back from the handle. But pulling her hand back didn't matter. She could still feel its impression on her skin, still feel its cold radiating from somewhere deep inside her body. The handle had imprinted itself on her consciousness. She was connected to it now, whether she touched it or not. She went downstairs. She finished her lasagna. She washed her dish. She turned on the television and watched programs that seemed to have no plot or purpose, just people talking about things she didn't understand. Or perhaps the programs did have plots and purposes, but she was unable to perceive them correctly. The narratives kept breaking apart, shifting, revealing themselves to be loops and cycles and patterns within patterns. At midnight, she heard the attic door open. At midnight, she heard footsteps descending the stairs. At midnight, she heard the breathing of something that had once been her, and she stood from her sofa and walked to the kitchen to meet her earlier self, to watch as yet another version of Margaret descended from the impossible space. And this version looked at the version that had already descended, and she said, "How long have you been here?" Margaret sat in the darkness with her thousand selves. Or her thousand selves were Margaret, sitting in her place at her time, occupying the same moment from different angles. Dimension was not as stable a concept as she had once believed. Space could fold, time could stack. Identity could fragment and multiply and recombine into new patterns. She tried to remember who she had been before the attic. What had her life been like? What had she done during the day? But the memories were mud now, slippery and formless. She had loved her husband, or had she? She had a daughter, or did she? These facts existed at some remove from her current reality, like stories someone had told her once. Stories about someone else's life that she had mistakenly believed to be her own. The truth was simpler. She had always been in the attic. There was no before. The house was not a place she had lived. The house was a space the attic had created, a membrane between different levels of descent, a threshold that appeared different depending on which side of it you were standing on. When you were alive, you saw it as a house. When you were dead, you saw it as an attic. When you were in transition, you saw it as both simultaneously, which was the most disorienting state of all. She understood now why Mrs. Caldwell had run from the house. She had seen something she shouldn't have. Perhaps she had seen through the membrane for a moment. Perhaps she had glimpsed the infinite Margarets sitting in the invisible spaces between the walls, watching her with black eyes, waiting for her to touch the handle herself. Perhaps she had recognized the signs of death that surrounded Margaret like an aura, the way Margaret never quite cast a shadow, the way her voice had a slight echo to it, the way her eyes occasionally seemed to be looking at you from very far away, from the bottom of a very deep well. Days passed, or didn't pass. Time had become unreliable. Sometimes Margaret would look at the calendar and discover that weeks had gone by. Sometimes she would blink and discover that it was still the same moment, still October 13th at midnight, still the moment before the footsteps began to descend. She began to understand the structure of the attic more clearly. It was not infinite in the way she had initially believed. It was iterative. It was a recursion. Each cycle created another cycle. Each descent created another level of descent, but they were all the same cycle, all the same descent, viewed from different angles, at different resolutions. The original Margaret, the one at the very center, so deep in the attic that she had ceased to be Margaret at all, was the keystone. She was the moment of entry, the point where the circle had no beginning, the first death that had spawned all the others. All the Margarets that came after her were echoes of that first descent, repetitions of that first moment of understanding. They were not moving forward into the future. They were spiraling deeper into the past, descending toward that first moment again. Round and round, always moving toward it, never quite reaching it, suspended in a state of eternal approach. Margaret realized that she had always known this. On some level, every version of her had always understood the nature of their existence. But the knowledge had to be discovered anew with each cycle, had to be learned and relearned and accepted again and again, because acceptance was the only thing that could sustain the cycle. If any Margaret truly gave up hope, if any Margaret stopped trying to escape, if any Margaret ceased to believe that there might be a way out, then the entire structure would collapse. The hope was necessary. The struggle was necessary. The moment of realization over and over was necessary, so Margaret continued her routines. She continued to count the days on her calendar. She continued to microwave frozen lasagnas. She continued to wash her dishes and dry them and put them away. She continued to live the life of a solitary widow, cut off from the world, marked by isolation. And each day she pretended that this was real. She pretended that she was alive. She pretended that there was a world beyond the walls of the house. And each pretense, each tiny act of self-deception, kept the cycle spinning. One evening, or perhaps it was the same evening it had always been, Margaret decided to try something different. Instead of waiting for the footsteps to begin, instead of waiting to see if the attic door would appear, she went upstairs and looked for it. She searched the second-floor hallway carefully, moving from one end to the other, running her hands along the ceiling, pushing at the plaster, looking for any sign of an opening. There was nothing. The ceiling was solid. There was no panel. There was no handle. There was no attic. She went downstairs and waited. At midnight, she heard the footsteps begin. She heard the door open. She heard the steps descending. And she waited to see what version of herself would appear in the kitchen this time. But nothing appeared. The footsteps descended all the way to the ground floor, moved across the hallway, entered the kitchen, stood directly behind her, and then nothing. No breathing. No voice. No black-eyed doppelganger stepping into view. "Hello?" Margaret called out. "Hello!" said a voice from behind her. But it was not her voice. It was a man's voice, deep and familiar and terribly sad. Margaret turned around. Standing in her kitchen was her husband. He looked exactly as he had looked on the day he died, wearing his favorite blue shirt, his hair just beginning to gray, his face peaceful and resigned. But his eyes were black, completely, utterly black. "Hello, Margaret," he said. "I've been waiting for you to be ready. I've been waiting up there in the attic with all the others. It's time now. It's time for you to come upstairs." "I'm not ready," Margaret said. "Yes, you are," her husband replied gently. "You've been ready for 19 years. You died when you touched the handle, Margaret. Everything since then has been you trying to delay the inevitable. But the delay is over now. It's time to go deeper." "Where are you taking me?" Margaret asked. "Down," her husband said. "Deeper down. To the level below the attic. Where all the Margarets go eventually, when they've finally accepted that they'll never escape. Where we become something else entirely." "What happens if I refuse?" "Then the cycle begins again," her husband said. "You wake up in the kitchen. You hear the footsteps. You climb the stairs. You reach for the handle. You descend into the attic once more. You meet all your other selves. You come to understand what you are. You try to escape. You fail. And then you wake up again, round and round forever and ever for all eternity, unless you accept, unless you let go." Margaret stood in her kitchen, looking at her dead husband, and she made a choice. She chose acceptance. She chose to stop struggling. She chose to climb the stairs one last time and keep climbing, past the attic, into whatever lay beneath it. She chose to become whatever the next level would make her become. She took her husband's hand. It was cold. It was not quite real. It was more like holding mist than holding flesh. Together they walked to the stairs and climbed. They climbed past the second floor, past the hallway, past the attic access panel. And they kept climbing, up into spaces that should not have existed, down into depths that should not have been possible, moving through dimensions that the human mind had never evolved to perceive. And then Margaret opened her eyes. She was standing in her kitchen. The microwave was beeping. The lasagna was rotating inside it. October 13th on the calendar. 3 years, 4 months, and 17 days marked with X's. She heard footsteps in the attic, but there was no attic. But there had always been an attic. But the attic had always been empty. But the attic had always been full. The contradictions. stacked on top of each other like layers of the earth. Each one as true as the others, each one as false as the others. Margaret walked to the base of the stairs and listened. She climbed the stairs. She reached for the handle. She touched the brass and felt the familiar cold. She opened the door. She climbed the ladder. She descended into the impossible space. The attic was full of Margarets. Or it was empty. Or it was both simultaneously. The versions of herself stood in perfect rows that stretched away in all directions, each one identical, each one waiting. They all turned to look at her as she descended, and they all smiled with teeth too numerous to fit, and they all spoke in unison. "Welcome home, Margaret. We've been waiting for you. We've always been waiting for you. You've finally come back where you belong. You've finally come home to the attic. You've finally come home to yourself." And Margaret opened her mouth to speak, but before she could form words, everything reset. She was standing in her kitchen. The microwave was beeping. The lasagna was rotating inside it. October 13th on the calendar. 3 years, 4 months, and 17 days marked with X's. She heard footsteps in the attic. She climbed the stairs. She reached for the handle. She touched the brass. She opened the door. She climbed the ladder. She descended into the impossible space. The attic was full of Margarets, all of them turning to look at her, all of them smiling with black eyes, all of them waiting. And Margaret realized with perfect clarity that this moment, this exact moment, was the only moment that had ever existed. There was no before it. There was no after it. There was only this single moment, repeated infinitely, spiral compressed into a point, a loop that had no entry and no exit, a prison made of her own consciousness. She tried to move, but her body would not obey her commands. She tried to speak, but her voice would not function. She tried to think of a way to break the cycle, but her thoughts themselves seemed to be locked into the pattern. She was frozen in amber, suspended in a moment that would repeat forever, and then, from somewhere very deep in the structure of the attic, from a place so far down that it barely qualified as existing at all, a voice spoke. It was ancient and patient and infinitely sad. It was the voice of the original Margaret, the one at the very center, the one who had been descending forever. "Stop fighting," the voice said. "There is no way out. There never was a way out. There will never be a way out. The house is gone. The world is gone. All that remains is the attic and us and this moment, repeating forever and ever without end. Accept this. Surrender to this. Become this. Only then will you find peace." And Margaret felt something give way inside her, some final resistance that she had been maintaining, some last desperate hope that refused to let go. It crumbled like old paper. It dissolved like mist. It faded like a dream upon waking. She accepted that she was dead. She accepted that she had always been dead. She accepted that the only existence she would ever know was this one, this moment, this cycle, this attic. She accepted that there would be no escape, no rescue, no sudden revelation that would set her free. She accepted that eternity was a very long time and she would be spending all of it here. And in accepting, something changed. The attic grew darker, or it grew lighter. The distinction ceased to matter. The Margarets around her began to fade or to become more vivid, or both. She could no longer perceive the walls. Or perhaps the walls had always been invisible. She could no longer remember her life before the attic. Or perhaps she had never had a life before the attic. All that remained was the endless moment, the single point, the loop that contained everything. She heard footsteps. Or perhaps she was the footsteps. Perhaps she was the one walking in the attic now. Had always been walking, would always be walking, moving from the eastern wall to the western wall and back again, searching for a way out that did not exist. Because the search was the attic and the attic was the search, and they were the same thing. She heard breathing. Or perhaps she was the breathing. The drowning sound breath of something that could not quite live and could not quite die, suspended in the eternal moment between states of being. She heard her own voice and all the other voices, speaking in unison. "Welcome home, Margaret. We've been waiting for you. You've finally come back where you belong." And Margaret realized that the voice speaking was her own. That the Margarets waiting were her. That the entire attic was her. That there had never been anything but her, watching herself descend eternally, moment after moment, cycle after cycle, rope wrapping around a drum, round and round forever and ever without beginning or end. She opened her eyes. The microwave was beeping. The lasagna was rotating. October 13th on the calendar. 3 years, 4 months, and 17 days marked with X's. She heard footsteps in the attic. She climbed the stairs. She reached for the handle. She touched the brass. She opened the door. She climbed the ladder. She descended into the impossible space where all her other selves were waiting, all of them turning to look at her, all of them smiling with black eyes, all of them speaking in unison. "Welcome home, Margaret. Welcome home. Welcome home. Welcome home. Welcome home to the attic. Welcome home to yourself. Welcome home to the moment that never ends. Welcome home to eternity." And the loop continued, and the loop would always continue. And Margaret had finally stopped trying to escape it, and that, perhaps, was the only escape that had ever been possible.